I'm glad that we're all here today to engage in some universal ideas. I'm sure a really good Q&A dialogue. There's 3 presentations. Cynthia, Dave, myself, we're all discussing what would be a good way to celebrate, on the one hand, Independence Day. 2 days ago was Independence Day. There was a war over 250 years ago that brought something new into being, but it wasn't really finalized. There was something unfinished. And the fact that that something was left unfinished has resulted in the creation of, I think, something very monstrous today. Something which we're seeing now creating a lot of turmoil, potentially a cataclysm the likes of which humanity may never have seen. I would say has never seen, potentially, just by virtue of the fact that we have 8 billion human beings on this planet. We have nuclear weapons scattered all over the planet. We have a lot of really bad ideas associated with power that are making policies that don't seem to be too committed to reality and are very committed to a certain delusion of what reality should be according to some script that has been built up over many generations. We also have certain things that are slipping away. So some nations don't want to be really don't want to participate on this sort of suicide bandwagon that we were all expected to participate in some decades ago, some generations ago. And there's something new that's been brought online. I thought that in the course of the 3 presentations, I'm going to do a little bit of something showcasing a new angle that a lot of people haven't really quite appreciated to the developments around 1776. Because this is something that is Canadian, and I think everyone here is Canadian, I believe. Mostly, okay, yeah. I didn't have any psycho-spiritual connection with really the importance of what 1776 was growing up. It was a relatively recent phenomenon that I started really appreciating what that battle was and why Canada is still a monarchy. So we also had a national holiday on July 1st of, we have that every year, just a few days before the U.S. the Americans have their national holiday, their Independence Day. It's an interesting clinical study, and I'm going to go through some examples of what we failed to do back in 1776 when Benjamin Franklin was up here. People will get a chance to go to the old port. There's something called the Ramsey House. It's a museum. And has anybody not been to the Ramsey House? Not been. Okay, go to the Ramsey House. It's a fun thing. And it's where the Governor General once lived, and it's where Benjamin Franklin in 1776 in April came to Canada, and he stayed here for a few weeks with a delegation from the U.S. And the purpose of that mission that he was on was to persuade the French Canadians who had recently been defeated. Right, Quebec was a French colony for a long time. They'd recently been defeated by the British Empire in the 7 Years' War. Coming out of the 7 Years' War, Britain became sort of the indisputed dominant empire of the world. They defeated all their French, their Spanish, their other rivals. Not to say that any of their rivals were good, but it became the sort of dominant warlord of the earth coming out of that process, and took all of the colonies and possessions of the French at that time, including especially Quebec. So Ben Franklin thought, okay, well, there's been a lot of abuses suffered by the French who have been living here. The British were not known for their gentility. He thought, well, we got a lot of sympathy amongst the French Canadians, so maybe we can organize them to be the 14th colony to stand with the 13 others, and all together say we're going to have a new kind of country based on rejection of hereditary institutions, might makes right, and instead create something new. So a lot of this that I'm going to go through today, and then Cynthia's going to pick this up, and then Dave's going to pick this up in another, we're going to just continue this journey. And it won't necessarily follow a linear sequence, a timeline in the conventional sense, but it is all part of the same idea. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to come from a book, Volume 1 of The Classical to Americans, The Unfinished Symphony. Has anybody got or owned a copy of this yet, or have people picked up a copy? Okay, a lot of people have already. So this may not surprise everybody here who's read it. However, there will hopefully be something new that will make you happy. Go to the next slide. All right, as I mentioned, Ben Franklin, it didn't work out. He didn't get the traction he needed. He didn't find the support he needed, although there was a vast amount of moral support from the people who definitely wanted to support the U.S. cause. He couldn't find anybody within a leadership position who could sanction a delegation to go down. And it was called, by the way, in 1776, the Continental Congress, because the idea was that this new type of country that they wanted to bring into being that was based on some form of representative democracy, that this was going to be something that would basically take the continent. It was a continent. That's why Washington called it a continental army. It wasn't the army of the 13 colonies. And most of the continent was owned by 89 or so percent of the surface area of the North American area, including Mexico, all of today's Canada, was pretty much owned by the French, the Spanish, the Russians, the Dutch. No, the Dutch had given it up, and the British. So this was like a very small minutia of terrain that said, okay, we need to kick out the empire system from the continent before we can do anything. So that's one of Ben Franklin's few failures. It didn't work out. He couldn't get the traction. He got a few people who did volunteer, people like Clement Gosselin, possibly related to David, perhaps. Figure that out. Who did become George Washington's French-Canadian spy and led a delegation of soldiers, of farmers to go and fight with Washington. But overall, the Jesuits, the Anglican clergy that were dominating the political structures didn't allow it. And we're going to see something about that. And we're going to compare what was done in the United States. So maybe the next slide. And I said this is not going to be sequential in a timeline fashion, but there was what one could say is a second American Revolution, about 85 or so, 86 years later, with the effort to keep the Union intact. And that was something which involved a lot of participation by the British Empire, the City of London, to break up the Union. We had Confederate bases all over Montreal that were running terrorist raids into the United States, into the Albany raids. You know, John Wilkes Booth was up here in Montreal. For those who don't know, the killer of Lincoln was up here for 5 weeks getting his pay from Henry Starnes, the president of the Bank of Ontario, who was found to have given a $500 note to Wilkes Booth before he was sent down with instructions to kill Lincoln. And Wilkes Booth was not alone. He was there were 4 people hung for the conspiracy to kill Lincoln. That's also something that we're not taught in school, so we don't appreciate the fact that there was a much bigger story behind the lone gunman official narrative. And if we looked at that bigger story, we would quickly discover that it was never about simply an internal struggle within the United States. There was a global chemistry. And the thing about looking at history, and that's the point of one of the lessons I hope people come out of this process, is an appreciation of the science of history, is that we're looking at anything scientifically. And of course, it's not so easy to say science of history because it's animated by free will. You know, atoms or planets don't have free will. They're not animated by ideas. So that you could say that there's a relative rhythm that's formulaic in the patterns of nature outside of human agency. But with human agency, there's still rhythms, laws, right? We still have physical laws that constrain that we need water, we need food, we need a certain amount of productive power. We need these things just for our bodies to live. But then we also have the function of metaphysics, of ideas that are right or wrong, the will to choose to do what is right or wrong, right? These are all factors that are kind of indeterminate. There's a little bit of a chaos factor. So to say science of history would offend some people, but I would say that there is a science. Because for those ideas that are true, provably true, that means in harmony with natural law. And when those are acted upon, there are certain effects that are natural, that are predictable. And like Lincoln said, the best way to forecast the future is to create the future. So with policies, you can actually chart out a future, and you don't know exactly how it's going to unfold, but you know we're going to build a dam. We need to end energy poverty in an area, so we're going to build a dam, or we're going to build a power station. And you know that the effect will be, if it is completed, an enriched people who will have more opportunities to use their minds, less scarcity, more abundance. That will be the general outcome. A general better sense of security for the future, better sense of knowledge, because you just built a dam. Like that took maybe 5-10 years. That took a lot of training along the way, right? Specialists had to be created where they're formerly ignorant people. So you have to now, it's transformative in that sense. So you know the general effect will be something. If you don't, if you say, well, we have to shut down food production to, because our computer models say that farmers are causing global warming because our computer models say. So we have to shut down the food to stop global warming because our computer models say. If you do that, you might have satisfied the computer models, but you could know that will have created a lot of scarcity, a lack of food, right? Greater insecurity, greater ability to induce wars for scarcity, because now people are in a fight or flight mode. So this is William Gilpin. He was a bodyguard of Lincoln. This chapter, the last chapter of the Prometheus of America, is on his story. He is one of the most, I think, underrated heroes of the 19th century. He was the father of manifest destiny. He was the earliest champion that I could see, supporting the building of a transcontinental railway across the continent. Never been done before. So he was doing that already in the 1840s. He was calling for, after the Civil War, or during the Civil War, he was made the governor of Colorado Territory, where he uniquely prevented the opening up of a Western Front. Had there been a Western Front open at that time in 1862, when Lincoln was already on the verge of losing, when the British Empire was supporting both logistically, financially, as well as through intel hubs out in Canada. So the U.S., I think there was no chance that the Union would have been preserved. There was no chance. So by him doing what he did and leading the battle at Glorieta Pass, he was able to fund this through the greenback system that he created on a state level. He gave an interview where he said, look, Lincoln educated me on what to do if I'm in a situation where there is no money, but something has to get done. And Lincoln later on did this through the greenbacks that were then destroyed after the Civil War, after Lincoln was killed. The idea of emitting credit and currency based on issuing treasury notes instead of asking private central banks to justify the creation of a monetary expansion. It's a different way of creating currency. And that idea of the greenback was tied to building real-world projects, which is what he did by funding his militia, other things through a state-level greenback system. And that won the Battle of Glorieta Pass. After that, he began organizing internationally for the last 30 years of his life to extend the transcontinental railway that was just being finished by 1869. That was when it was finished. Time for the first time, a whole continent coast to coast by rail, and opening up inland development, new industrial corridors, and most importantly, liberating the entire nation from dependency upon British monopoly over shipping lanes. And that's how the British ruled the world, right? As a one world government, was through controlling choke points, getting everybody addicted to debts that are unpayable, that are associated with speculation. That's why you open up the doors to free trade. So you don't actually allow for protectionism. You allow only for the markets to determine what the value of things are going to be. And then because things are so volatile, you can't think ahead, you can't plan ahead, because you don't know what the value of your currencies are going to be in like a year, let alone a month from now. So you can't plan big things like that. Whereas protectionism, national central banking that are nationally, not private controlled, this is what Lincoln was doing, this is what Gilpin advocated, this is what America generated, was based upon emitting credits for the building up of things that are 20, 30, 40 years. And the transcontinental railway was supposed to connect through Alaska that had just been sold by Russia to the Americans in 1867, one day before Canada Day. Right, so there's a big race over what is going to be Canada's role within this new world that's being created based on cooperation. So things went another way. That didn't happen. There was an age of chaos. This is actually something similar to what we're about to see. These are some of the key characters who played a role as Lincoln allies around the world who are applying the Lincoln method of building up a nation state. In Russia, Count Sergei Witte there on the left, Otto von Bismarck, Sadi Carnot, the president of France, assassinated 1894. Friedrich List, who organized an American systems Zollverein, a customs union to unify Germany and make it an integrated nation for the first time. These also probably assassinated. So these were just a small sampling, but there's a much larger sampling of great leaders who died and did a lot to expand this system of post-imperial cooperation around the world in the 1880s, 1890s. And again, like Tsar Nicholas II, Alexander II, Alexander III, Garfield, McKinley, many of them were killed. But they did a lot. And what they created has taken generations for the oligarchy to try to undo. And even there, I would say that the oligarchy has not been successful, despite the wars, the assassinations that were done to try to overturn this chessboard. Next slide. That's a quick sampling of the Trans-Siberian Railway and some of the figures who are bringing that into the line, including the scientist Dmitry Mendeleev, who was in charge of the Committee on the Protective Tariff of Russia, applying the protective tariff system of America to cultivate indigenous industrial production within Russia that had formerly been addicted to slave labor. That's where the serfs were a key part of the economy for a long time. And when Tsar Nicholas Alexander II liberated the serfs, that was done right before Lincoln did the same thing in America. But then they had to think, well, how do you now transform the economy to put all of these people to work? Now that they're free, they need education, they need to have job opportunities. Like, you need a totally different way of thinking about economics than we formerly were addicted to. How do you do that? So this is part of the solution. Again, never permitted to blossom. Although it was built with American engineers, with Baldwin locomotives from Philadelphia. And again, so it's supposed to connect down through the Bering Strait over a century ago. Next slide. And again, Gilpin was very clear that the renewal of the West and the corruption of the West could only be salvaged by an appreciation of the Chinese civilization, of Russian civilization, and Asiatic civilization, finding something new to give a rebirth to what we had lost morally in the West. He was thinking very much on Benjamin Franklin's lines too, because Benjamin Franklin was also fighting to have this new type of U.S. government, this republic, based upon the Chinese meritocratic system. He was translating Confucius into the United States in the 1740s. So very important. But instead of that, we had Canada adopt a different system where BC was about, instead of joining up with this rail connection into Alaska, we had instead a bribe where Britain, using one of their stooges, who's sold as a hero for Canadians, John A. Macdonald, was told to give this this colony of British Columbia everything that they could possibly want to keep them enmeshed with the British Crown. Pay off their debts. They're bankrupt, whatever, pay off the debt, ignore it. They're separated by this massive region of private Hudson's Bay land. Nationalize it, buy it up for pennies on the dollar, and then build a rail line to connect them to the other colonies here. That's all we had in Canada at the time. And it took about 15 years, but John A. Macdonald said that I would be quite willing personally to leave the whole country a wilderness for the next half century, but I fear if Englishmen do not go there, Yankees will. So this is very reluctant. He didn't want to build Canada. He did it only because it was geopolitically expedient to keep the continent from actually going in the Gilpin orientation. Next slide. And when I mentioned Canada was mostly Rupert's Land or Hudson Bay land, that's basically it. It was like 80% of the surface area of Canada was a private company tied to the the British East India Company, very, very much overlapping directors, that was there for over 200 years, ensuring that the continent remained underdeveloped. Basically, our identity was supposed to be forever, fur traders and timberers. Yeah, that was supposed to be our forever economy. Water, furs, that's it. Timber. Pretty much, yeah. So that wasn't compatible with where the world was going. The world was going in another direction. So to stay relevant, the British Empire realized they had to sort of unshackle some of this industrial and creative power just to stay relevant, which actually touches upon some of the dynamics today, if you think about it. Next slide. Now we're going to slowly transition to the American Revolution, but before we do, I want to just get a sense of it, make it visceral for those who haven't read the Canadian Constitution. I never read it until somewhat recently. I didn't read it in school. Did people read the Canadian Constitution in school? You did in school? Yeah? Okay, you're one of the few. I don't know many people who did. What'd you think of it when you first read it? It was like...
I had more questions. It was a little bit underwhelming.
It was underwhelming, right? Not that exciting.
No.
Yeah, it's a bit dry. And on a few paragraphs into it, this is effectively what I see as the preamble. In 1867, right when Alaska is being sold to the United States, at the same moment, and there's a fight over whether British Columbia is going to go with the development program, are the Lincoln allies in Ottawa, are they going to be able to create, at the very least, an independent Canada that's a republic, that's not under an empire, not under a privy council? Is that possible? And there were Lincoln allies in Canada in power positions. We could have done that. But instead, we had John A. Macdonald, the guy who said, a Britisher I was born, a Britisher I'm going to die. Who tried to call for an Aryan Canada in our Constitution. This guy's the hero of Canada, our founding father, he wanted to have an Aryan Constitution. for only Aryans who could prove their pure blood could be Canadian citizens. And people say, oh, but don't worry, that was the 19th century, everybody was talking like that. And it's like, well, he was the only one. Everyone else in Parliament was too embarrassed to say that out loud. And he wasn't. So he did love this, and this was drafted in 1864. It was only signed into law by Victoria in 1867. And in it says, whereas the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have expressed a desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom. And whereas such a union would conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. That's pretty clear. So, next one, that's what a fake constitution looks like. Slightly more reasonable here. Is there one after this? Actually, let's go to the one after this first. Okay, so this is what the Empire was afraid was going to happen in Canada if they didn't do all of these shenanigans, which was establish a type of government, either, God forbid, join Lincoln's America or create a republic based upon this type of idea that involved a founding document that says that the purpose of the nation is to protect the general welfare, to form a more perfect union, not for the sake of an empire, but for the sake of the people who make up that government. And it says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. So again, very different idea. And this is supposed to be read in harmony with the Declaration of Independence. The idea that you have a nation that's designed to form a more perfect union, which right there is illogical. If you're somebody who's purely into pure computer logic, reading the word more perfect union seems like grammatically absurd. Because either you're perfect or you're more better, but you can't be more perfect. However, they're not logicians. Like the founders were smarter than these computer thinking people are today, and they understood that human existence is a struggle to perfectibility. That's the point of being a human, is you can always self-perfect yourself and always help the thing you're born into, the society, become better in some way, actualize more potential towards the good, based on certain principles that are immutable, certain ideas of justice, right? Which no matter what country you're born into, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's China, whether it's 5,000 years ago or a million years in the future, there's certain principles by being human that will always be involved with justice, no matter what. The idea of giving for others, giving for your kids, that's going to be something that is valued. We find that always valued within the midst of the sacred traditions that are really viable and good in all cultures, in India and everywhere. We'll always find something noble that we all like, right? That ties us to that higher idea of natural law. So that idea of a more perfect union and justice, the general welfare, which again pisses off a lot of libertarians. They don't like the idea of general welfare. They say it's so abstract. It justifies tyranny, and it's true. It's true. A lot of tyranny has been justified by we have to do this for the greater good. That's true. But that's the point, right? Is that you have to have an informed and engaged moral people who are culturally self-aware and mature to be citizens in order to be part of the government. Because if you detach the individual citizen from the government intellectually, then guarantee you'll always get a bunch of subjects, people who see themselves either as being servants of the empire or of the government, or that expect to be treated or provided for by the government, or people who are just in opposition to the government, because the government is always perceived as being against my freedom. But if you actually have a more mature type of culture, where people look in the mirror and say, okay, I am the government. This is being held together by my engagement. These are where my freedoms come from, through my responsibilities to defend them and to keep the defense going and active for the next generation. If you got that, then this whole abuse of the general welfare becomes impossible. But that's part of the struggle. Let's skip to let's go to the Declaration of Independence. Don't rush. Yeah, you got so much to go through in this slideshow.
Doing a great job.
Okay, thank you. All right. So the Declaration of Independence is seen as, and it's been understood by proper legal scholars over the centuries, including Lincoln, as two sides of the Constitution. So the Constitution of 1787 and the Declaration of 1776 are really two sides of the same thing. So all of how we read any of the formal aspects of law always have to be read through that tempering of the principles outlaid very clearly in those founding documents. Which again, Canada we've come close at different times. I think John D. did something pretty noble by trying to get us something similar to this in 1960, but it didn't really go anywhere after that with our certain Canadian Constitution, which was a noble effort, but short-lived. Now, but this says, we hold that these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the rights of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Revolutionary idea. But again, this is why, as I mentioned earlier, people like Ben Franklin, even Thomas Jefferson, who had a ton of problems, Jefferson, very disappointing character. But despite that, smarter than a lot of the lame intellectuals today, understood that it was so important to study the works of Confucius, of Mencius. This is what Ben Franklin was translating and publishing the Analects into the American colonies. Because if you actually read Mencius, you recognize very clearly this is exactly what's there. That a leader of a society, an emperor or whomever, only has the mandate to have authority over the society that they're leading over. If they are obeying the mandate of heaven, that there's a hierarchy of Tian Ming, that if a leader becomes abusive to those ends, that it is the responsibility of the people to overthrow said ruler and institute better laws, better in harmony with the laws of heaven. So that's a very important concept that, again, we've been detached from over the years as we've been told that East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet. And this has been put forward again and again over centuries into our psyche to make us believe that the Eastern culture is this emotional culture and the Western culture is this Enlightenment logical culture. And the right brain, left brain dichotomy of cultures can never coalesce, maybe through irrationalism. Maybe if we'll get equally irrational, maybe then we can coalesce. But otherwise, you can't actually have any type of communion. That's an imperial lie by people like Rudyard Kipling, who was a racist bigot, who was promoting this type of idea that was dishonest from the start. As if the West doesn't have emotions and the East doesn't have logical thinking. That's garbage. Everybody, these are two sides of the human condition. And as we're going to see, there's a lot of East-West dynamics that made the American Revolution possible. Next one. Yeah, okay, sure. So I mentioned already Canada's failure in the 1867 period to take on the Lincoln Challenge, which in many ways was the Benjamin Franklin Challenge the second time. But what was this challenge? I was mentioning it earlier, right? Ben Franklin was there in Ramsey House, right down in the Old Fort. He was organizing and failed to achieve the success that he set out for, which was to get a Quebec delegation to be the 14th delegation, say to the world that we are going to stand with the other 13 colonies and have a new type of government. It didn't work. Bishop Briand basically was the head bishop of the time, sanctioned by the crown, and put out a rule basically saying that if anybody fights with Washington, you'll excommunicate it, and thus, when you die, you'll burn in hellfire forever. And there's a highly superstitious French-Canadian culture at the time, very Catholic, very scary, burning in hellfire forever. So while their hearts had a lot of sympathy for the cause, they didn't actually have to get up and go to do it, except for a few noble souls who actually did overcome the superstition. But it worked to keep Quebec engaged and sucked into the British machine. Now, the thing about this is that up there is a postage stamp from 2006 featuring Ben Franklin on the Canadian postage stamp celebrating 250 years of Canada Post. And you're like, why? Why is that guy, who's the founding father of the founding fathers, on the Canadian postage stamp? Because he founded the Canadian Postal Service in 1757 or 1754. Ben Franklin founded the Canadian Postal Service because he was already thinking, how are we going to be able to create a culture in Canada that will have the wits and the understanding to think big and not local, that will then understand what it means to fight and even be willing to die for a new type of society. You couldn't do that if you have an illiterate people who don't think about what's going on in another village or another part of the continent. That requires communications, so postal service, very important. The Montreal Gazette still exists. Unfortunately, it's become toilet paper, but when it was created, it was a printing press that Ben Franklin started through his ally in France, who he brought in from France in order to manage the printing press of the first Canadian newspaper, because you need illiterate people who are able to read big things in order to understand why I should die, why I should fight for something better, why is this unjust, what does injustice mean? If all I've ever known is scarcity and injustice, how do I judge injustice if that's all I know? You got to read. So things like his letters to the inhabitants of Quebec, which was published by the printing presses of in Canada, was done to try to, and this was written by the Continental Congress to really make an appeal to come out, just be part of the conversation. That fell on deaf ears. But it's still, I mean, these are real nation-building things built not by the British Empire, it's built by a Republican patriot in America that built a lot of things we take for granted here in Canada. So the next one, I guess. Right, and part of the thing that kept Canada was partially a threat to burn hellfire, partially that. The other part of what kept Canada or Quebec enmeshed with the British Empire is one of the top intolerable acts. So when you read the Declaration of Independence, there's like 20 or so, I forget how many intolerable acts. 27 intolerable acts, right? 17 is taxation without representation. Usually, if you're an American, that's all you learn. So we had we didn't want any taxes, so that's what we fought and had a revolution. It's like, no, you got to read all 27. And there's more important ones than taxation without representation, of which the top one, I would say, or one of the top ones, was the Quebec Act of 1774, which is sort of the Canadian first constitution ever given to us. There's been several versions, right, rebrandings of the Constitution that are all fake constitutions. This was sort of the first one that basically took what was formerly in 1773. This is the area of Quebec. This is First Nations territory. These are the colonies, right, down here. And the British basically said, okay, let's just extend all of that area down all the way down to the south of the Ohio River. And this was understood to stop the discussion of the Continental Congress, because part of the way that the paradigm of Ben Franklin was, you've got to keep empires and deep state operatives off the continent, so that because they will always sabotage anything you're trying to do, always. So you've got to open up the West. You have to begin to find a way to work with the natives in a way that is respectful. And if you read Benjamin Franklin, his writings on how to engage with the Cherokee, much, much healthier. It's like a breath of fresh air versus like what was done by the racists like Andrew Jackson, who said, okay, they're lower humans. Let's just put them in little concentration camps and reserves and maybe manipulate them for our benefit, But there was another idea of manifest destiny that we're not told about that was actually pretty damn good. But that's not the one that was allowed to really be acted upon. But so part of that was to cut off the colonists from being able to open up the West. And also, unfortunately, you did have, and this is something Cynthia has already published some stuff on, a lot of Jesuit manipulation of native bands to be used to keep, to basically scalp and kill a lot of colonists at the same time as you had a lot of racist colonists doing a lot of unjust things to the natives. So you had this like forever Palestine, Israel type of forever war formula put into motion of an eye for an eye forever, which also made good relations very difficult. But all that to say, this is one of the things that kept Canada bribed, and we're told, okay, we'll have local freedoms. If you stay loyal to the crown, the Quebec will be allowed to have civil law. They won't have British common law. They'll have like local control of your mini little area of Quebec City or Montreal. But so we'll give you what's called, Pierre Baudry brought this to my attention some years ago, a policy called emploi rapide. So we're going to give you all of these comforts, but just stay loyal. Don't go with your principles. And this actually became a French-Canadian term used colloquially to be, has anybody heard of the term emploi rapide?
No. It's not said like that.
What does that mean in French when somebody said that? What does that mean? Been had, right? And it literally means to wrap in fur. Infrared, right?
No, it means to deceive. It means to deceive.
No, I'm saying the infrared. But I'm saying that the meaning of it is to deceive, but it's to be deceived through this being wrapped for being like full of anger. It's all good. It's so nice. So that was one thing that kept Canada sucked into this thing. So let's go to the next one. Oh. Yeah, okay. That's unfortunately kind of like washed out from the lighting, but that's a cool painting of Ben Franklin that we have on The Untold History of Canada, Volume 1, is this painting by Benjamin West of Ben Franklin and a couple of little angels, cherubs, and Ben Franklin's holding a key with a hit of lightning. So this is celebrated, it's called Prometheus of America. And that's what Benjamin Franklin was known for in Europe, was the Prometheus of America, because he was the guy who was not born of a noble family. He didn't have a special education, but he had curiosity. He was able to ask questions that educated people knew that to be truly intelligent, you can't ask stupid questions. Like, why is there electricity? Why does fire always go up, right? Like basic questions that kids would ask. Educated people are told, no, there's an answer out there somewhere. You're going to sound stupid. Don't ask questions, just memorize formulas. So that's why they weren't able to, all of the great scientists of Europe were not able to make this discovery, whereas Ben Franklin, a guy who like lived in the country and like had a bearskin cat, but was trained by Cotton Mather. He was trained by Cotton Mather, yeah. But that being said, he's still like he wasn't respected by the nobles of Europe. But he's the one who made the discoveries of the nature of electricity and then was able to prove that his discoveries, his metaphysical thoughts, his ideas about what it is, were true because he was then able to build inventions like the lightning rod and so many other things that would then harness that power and use it for the good of people. So you could, you had his life being lived the way he chose to live it, with the demonstrations of discoveries that he chose to have, and the application of those discoveries in the form of inventions that he chose to do, directly demonstrated through one individual that there's reciprocal nature both of the universe and its laws and human life and our laws, if you act according to certain self-discipline, right? And you allow certain childlike wonder to not die. If you allow that, you don't have to be even a high-blood oligarch. You can actually just be a human being who can do that. And that was part of, I think, one of the dangers of Ben Franklin for the oligarch, is that he represented, in his living being and the way he conducted himself, the very fact that the entire oligarchical system was a fraud. And this guy who painted this painting, this guy's so brilliant. Benjamin West is an American from Philadelphia, Republican, who Benjamin Franklin organized to get into England as one of the top world painters of the day. And he rose just through his skill set, and there were some allies in Britain at the time, to become the president of the British Royal Society of Fine Arts by 1780. This guy, Benjamin West, and you look at his paintings, he's doing something very, very specific against the Dilettante Society, which is sort of the Hellfire Club Society of Britain that was trying to take control of the cultural warfare fight. He was fighting against the worst elements of Francis Dashwood, all the Hellfire Club Satanists who were like dominating Britain. That was Benjamin West's enemies, and he was able to succeed in the belly of the beast. And he painted this wonderful painting of Ben Franklin. When he was in London, he ended up getting kicked out of that position for obvious reasons, but very interesting character. But this international approach of Ben Franklin is key, because he got a Republican talent who he was the godfather of Benjamin West's son, actually, to be in that position as a cultural warrior, influencing the actual aesthetics of the empire itself. So the next slide. Just to say, I'm not going to read all that, but he did a lot. It wasn't just the Postal Service of Canada. He sent the first Pennsylvania Gazettes. He was issuing documents on how to create paper currency, how to break free of private central banking. He did a lot. On top of his discoveries of electricity, on top of organizing for the American Revolution. Let's go to the next one. He actually was he's a cartoonist. He designed the join or die icon that we've all seen a million times over. He designed this in 1756 in order to make his first case that in the fight against the French Empire and the other empires during the 7 Years' War, that the colonies had to, for the first time, unite and work together. That's why he did this. It wasn't for the American Revolution, though it was used later on for the American Revolution. But it was designed in 1756. Fascinating. And ultimately, they didn't go with that. They stayed divided, made it a lot more difficult to carry out the fight. So yeah, it's part of his argument for a new type of currency. So he understood that you can't just have political independence, you have to have economic independence. That means you have to have a banking system that's tied to moral values. So he described in this 1729 paper currency essay, which justified the creation of the colonial script, a short-lived but very valid form of script that was issued by the colonies before the Revolution, which allowed for the creation of industrial output and industrial goods where formerly there was none. He says we have here in the colonies, because of this script that had just been created in the late 1720s. We have no poorhouses in the colonies. And if we had some, there would be nobody to put them in. Since there is in the colonies not a single unemployed person, neither beggars nor tramps. In the colonies, we issue our own paper money. It's called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to make the goods and pass it easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to no one. That system evolved in the form of what Alexander Hamilton did in his essays to his reports to the Congress in the 1790s, but he was directly taking from this whole tradition that then took on more life under Lincoln's allies, like Clay, Carey, Quincy Adams, Matthew Carey, Lincoln, obviously, this greenbacks that I mentioned at the beginning. This is all the manifestation of what we just read from Ben Franklin earlier on. And itself, this whole process was a direct continuity of what was done in France under people like Jean-Baptiste Colbert that created the basis of the first sovereign nation state, the Colbertism, the religious policy of direct credit through national treasuries for big public works. That is transformative stuff. I mentioned already the Confucian angle. That's important as far as what Ben Franklin understood. If America is going to survive, it has to have some form of meritocracy. You can't just have you can't have a system where the deep state is allowed to just have the rule of what Quan often calls the capistocratic system. You can't have a capistocracy. If you have a system that's based entirely on mob rule or the rule of whoever can persuade the masses or whoever can buy their positions through, let's say, their ill-begotten gains that they got maybe from selling drugs on the opium trade or slaves, or let's say just being part of a family that got into a club skull and bones secret society. If that's going to be the basis upon which you're going to elevate the people to positions of policy, that will become a capistocracy very quickly. And a capistocracy, I love this. What actually, you have a bigger term for it. It's not just a capistocracy. It's what's your full term that you innovated? I love it.
Yeah, that's the KFC as a L, meaning the capistocratic feudal conglomerate of the Anglo-American establishment.
I love that expression. And we did put that in your absolutely.
I insist that conglomerate, I chose that word because that kind of rulers are not truly rulers, so they cannot be called government, but conglomerate, which is a kind of business model.
Absolutely. That's a good one. No, that's it. So that's exactly what Ben, that should not have been a surprise to us that we have that now. That was already being discussed when Ben Franklin said, in response to the woman who asked, what did you create? Well, what do we have at the Constitutional Convention? He said, a republic, if you can keep it. That whole if you can keep it is based upon the idea that you need to now, you're responsible for not having it become what Quanda said. And part of that was the study of Confucius. That was really what Ben Franklin was very much resonating to. But let's go to the next one. Okay, so I'm going to end the last little section here. We already have been painting a little bit of the international dynamics that made 1776 happen. Let's go into some concrete case studies now. So what you have there is Baron von Steuben, a Prussian general who trained the American farmers who never fought seriously or who had very little fighting experience. Many of them were young. They didn't live through the 7 Years' War. They needed training in some sense. So you had a huge Prussian contingent around Steuben, around Kosciuszko, who was a Polish Republican general who also fought the whole Polish constituency, who came down to also train and fight. You had, I believe, I'm actually forgetting who this is now. I think it's Matthew Lafayette, but I forget. Yes. You had Matthew Lafayette, who was also brought in, who volunteered with thousands of idealist young men from the French aristocracy, from the French military, who recognized that something more beautiful was possible for humanity. Now, admittedly, some of the French within the aristocracy of France around the king were doing it for other reasons. They were doing it because they knew that, hey, if we support the colonists, we could weaken our rival British Empire who just screwed us over 2 years earlier in the 7 Years' War. So you did have different intentions, but you did have very high-level quality people who were doing it for the right reasons, and that's important. Many of them were organized by Ben Franklin, who was already an ambassador to France in the 1750s and was an ambassador managing the European Republican cause throughout, before, and during, and after the Civil War, the American Revolution. And he was really good. He even organized King Louis the XVI to feel some sympathy towards this idea that maybe we can have a world without hereditary monarchs. So convincing a hereditary monarch that that's actually a good thing you should support is not easy. Just like how his buddy Benjamin West was organized to befriend and organize George III, who people might know as Mad King George. Part of the problem there with the accounts of Benjamin West and the people around George III is that George III actually was won over to a certain degree to the cause that Benjamin West was arguing for, and West was the same age as George III. He would keep him in Westminster Buckingham Palace till late into the night talking philosophy, having debates and discussions while he was painting him and his family. Now, part of the thing was, George III became somebody who, unfortunately, from my analysis, couldn't live being a human with a conscience in a system that expected him to oversee evil. He couldn't mesh. He couldn't adapt to that world. Those two opposing principles, and he did go crazy, and he was removed from power. But just to say, like, there was an effort to actually transform the governing class into something better. And a lot of the people who were doing that work were the scientists, were the artists. Benjamin West was working with. I won't go into that. So you have some examples. So let's go to the next slide. I forget what I have next. Most importantly, the League of Armed Neutrality. One of the things that made the American Revolution possible in 1780 was the fact that you had Catherine the Great and Ekaterina Dashkova. Ekaterina Dashkova was an ally of Catherine the Great, who was made president of the Russian Academy of Sciences. First woman president, but not just any old woman president. She actually became a total reformer. She purged the Academy of corruption. She brought in a new mission orientation to make real good discoveries. She loved Benjamin Franklin and made him the first honorary member of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Benjamin Franklin made her the first Russian member of the American Philosophical Society that he had created in the 1740s. She had organized Catherine the Great to create the League of Armed Neutrality that ensured a constant flow of protected goods, of weapons, munitions, of other things from the European powers against Britain to support the colonies. So again, without Russia, at that point, there would not have been an American Revolution. It would have failed. Hyder Ali, the first American ship that ever was built as far as like a warship in 1784, was called the Hyder Ali, the SS Hyder Ali. Why? Who was Hyder Ali? Hyder Ali was a Muslim revolutionary fighting against the British Empire in Mysore, in the southern part of India. And for decades, him and his son Tipu Sultan successfully managed one of the most effective battles against the British Empire in India's entire history. And they've never been forgiven for this. There's still all sorts of, if you Google Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan today, you'll see all sorts of horrendous things about them, about how they're killers and genocidalists. I can guarantee you, when you actually try to prove any of that, it's all gossipy hearsay cooked up by British imperialists. None of that's real. But that's Hyder Ali being organized by Ambassador Suffren, the French ambassador to India, who was a friend of Benjamin Franklin, who had organized to get the Indian resistance fighters to work together in harmony and in tandem with the American revolutionaries of the Continental Congress. And his son, Tipu Sultan, I think I have on the next slide, maybe. This one? Sure, okay, yeah. So Tipu Sultan he wrote letters to the Continental Congress in 1782, saying that every blow that is struck in the cause of American liberty throughout the world, in France, India, and elsewhere, and so long as a single insolent savage tyrant remains, the struggle shall continue. So he's directly writing, and he was thanked by George Washington because their work absorbed 20% of the British Navy that was supposed to go towards putting down the American revolutionaries, and instead they had to be redirected towards India, where they got sucked into an over 15-year war to shut down the rebellion. Go above the back one slide. These are rockets blowing up British soldiers. They're Indian rockets. And actually, the Indians were the most innovative, advanced rocket scientists of the world who innovated high precision rocketry way before anyone else. And it was actually took the British something like a decade to reverse engineer some of these rockets that didn't slowly kill them and figure out how to do it. Yeah, and the British started doing it in like the 1801 period. But Tipu Sultan and the Indians were already doing it. And this is actually a painting in the NASA headquarters on the history of rocketry. So interesting stuff there too. Sidi Muhammad, another Muslim ruler, right, who was actually the first leader of the world to recognize America as an independent country in December 1st, 1777. The first country was a Muslim Morocco that recognized the U.S. as a sovereign country. And through again, Benjamin Franklin, he had a huge amount of networks of the French embassies in Morocco that organized him to provide support and protection to American ships from Barbary pirates. Barbary pirates were a lot of the Tunisian, Algerian, other North African pirates that were largely being used as proxies by the British Empire to carry out all forms of asymmetrical warfare against against the Americans and everybody really. So Sidi Muhammad was providing a massive amount of protection. Unfortunately, in the mid to late 1780 or 90s, after this, there was the first American war was the American Barbary War. Unfortunately, based on the deep state sabotaging a lot of these positive developments, and Benjamin Franklin's objective to create a special relationship with the Muslim world was sabotaged. But it was a real thing that he was putting into motion. Anyway, the stage was set. The stage was set for not just the U.S., like after the U.S. had successfully managed to kick out the British and establish this new kind of country, the stage was finally set now for this to go to the next level. And it had to work in France first. So part of those allies, like Jean-Sylvain Bailly, who's known as the Benjamin Franklin of France, he was the world's leading astronomer, and also a Vedic scholar, Jean-Sylvain Bailly. He was the mayor of Paris. He oversaw the tennis court oath in 1789, July 14, I think it's July 14, or June 14, 1789. And the tennis court oath was based upon the French basically saying we're going to create a new type of government based on a Republican hybrid constitutional monarchy based upon the principles of the U.S. Constitution that will be applied to our context. You had Lavoisier, the great French chemist, who made huge revolutionary discoveries in chemistry, who was part of this Republican network. You had artists galore. A lot of the artists and the scientists were all working together. And when most scientists were artists, most artists were scientists back then. That was before the days of postmodern. CIA-funded fine arts started taking over and separating those two worlds of emotion and thinking, like we were born into, all of us here. But that wasn't normal. For most of human history, that wasn't normal. That was understood that the thinking, the feeling side were two aspects of the human soul that had to both be nurtured together in a harmonic way, right? So the idea of a world of win-win cooperation was a beautiful mission. We came close to achieving it, but something happened in France. And if it didn't work in France, it couldn't have worked elsewhere. If it did work in France, it could have immediately begun to be applied elsewhere. You had similar people around Kosciuszko in Poland. You had people around Schiller in Germany and Prussia who were building up a whole Republican network to establish similar types of systems based on economic development, large-scale cooperation. They were ready to go. And the cultural level was being advanced to the point that people could appreciate higher metaphysics. They were able to work through the writings of if you could read the writings of a Leibniz or Schiller, then you would qualify as being a citizen. If you could listen in an active way to a symphony by Mozart or by the Well-Tempered Clavier by Bach, if you could do that and enjoy it, and do it actively, not passively, you can qualify as a citizen. You will find your mind moving in a totally different geometry that is not allowed under systems of feudalism. Anytime you have a death cult that's trying to manage the world, they don't allow that. They don't want that. Because that's the type of society that has self-discipline, right? A real aristocratic, as Kwan says, a real aristocratic society where everybody has a true aristocratic education that becomes sovereigns. Everybody becomes sovereign. That's the one we have a sovereign nation. It's why it's made up of sovereign people. And a sovereign people is a people of self-control, but also a love for the good at the same time. So with that, we're going to look at maybe figure too about what happened. Why did the French Revolution fail, where the American Revolution was more of a success in a certain sense? And how does that impact some lessons that we could learn about today's world? So with that, Cynthia, it's all